On a summer evening 5 years after that first desperate knock on her door, Clara stood in her garden watching the sunset. Sarah was playing in the yard, her laughter ringing out as Thomas chased her, pretending to be a fearsome bear. The girl shrieked with delight, running in circles, her dark hair flying behind her. Clara felt a deep sense of peace. Her life had not turned out how she expected. She had thought she would grow old alone, managing her ranch, keeping her grief private. Instead, she had found purpose, family, and joy in the most unexpected places. The garden around her was thriving, rows of vegetables growing strong in the rich soil. She had spent the afternoon weeding and watering, her hands dark with earth. The smell of growing things, of life pushing up through the ground, always calmed her. It reminded her that things could grow even in harsh conditions, that with care and patience, almost anything could thrive. She thought about the day Thomas had arrived, how different things had been then. The house had felt like a tomb, every room echoing with absence. She had gone through her days mechanically, doing what needed to be done but finding no real joy in it. She had wondered sometimes if this was all her life would be until she died: work, sleep, endless repetition with no real purpose beyond survival. Then Thomas had collapsed on her porch with Sarah in his arms, and everything changed. At first, she had seen it as a temporary situation, something she would help with briefly before returning to her solitary life. But as days turned to weeks and weeks to months, she realized she didn't want to return to that emptiness. These two people had given her back something she thought she had lost forever, a reason to wake up in the morning beyond mere necessity. Thomas caught Sarah and swung her up onto his shoulders. The girl squealed, gripping his hair for balance, still laughing. He walked toward Clara, grinning in a way that made him look years younger than when he had first arrived. "Dinner ready?" he called. "Almost. Wash up, both of you." As they headed toward the house, Sarah called back to her. "Mama, watch me. I'm the tallest person in the world." Clara smiled. "Yes you are, sweetheart. Come on, let's eat." Inside, the table was set, the food was hot, and the house smelled of fresh bread and herbs. They sat together, saying grace, then filling their plates. Sarah chattered about her day, about the calf born that morning, about the butterfly she'd chased through the meadow until it finally landed on a flower and let her get close enough to really see its wings. "It had blue on it," she said excitedly. "Bright blue, like the sky. And black edges. Is that what all butterflies look like, Mama?" "There are many different kinds," Clara explained. "Some have different colors, different patterns. Each kind is unique." "Like people?" Sarah asked. "Exactly like people," Clara agreed, pleased by the connection her daughter had made. Thomas listened with patience, asking questions, encouraging Sarah's observations. He had a gift for making her feel heard, for treating her thoughts as on a scorching afternoon when the sun beat down mercilessly and dust devils danced across the prairie. Widow Clara opened her ranch door to find a man barely standing, sun-scorched and desperate, clutching a tiny infant wrapped in torn fabric. She pulled them both inside, bolted the door, never knowing that moment would bind her to a fight for survival. And from the instant the baby girl made her first sound, every doubt transformed into an oath to guard them until her final breath. The heat that day was brutal, pressing down like a weight that squeezed the air from lungs and turned every breath into labor. The sun hung white and merciless in a bleached sky, casting no shade worth mentioning. Dust rose in columns from the parched earth, swirling through the gaps in the fence posts before settling on every surface inside and out. The smell of dry grass and sunbaked wood filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of horses from the stable. Clara stood near the window, her hands resting on the sill, watching the heat shimmer across the valley. The whole landscape seemed to waver in the brightness, hills dissolving into pale gold, the distant creek bed nothing but a white scar cutting through brown earth. A hawk circled high above, its cry sharp and lonely. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. It was weak, barely audible, yet carried an urgency that made Clara's heart tighten. She crossed the wooden floor, each step echoing in the quiet. When her hand touched the latch, she hesitated, listening to her own breathing match the rhythm of the cicadas outside. She opened the door and the blast of heat struck her face immediately. Standing on the porch was a tall man, his shirt torn and stained with dust and sweat, his dark hair matted to his forehead. His face was burnt red from the sun, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Thomas stood there, swaying slightly, one arm cradling a bundle wrapped in what looked like a torn blanket. Clara needed only a heartbeat to recognize the bundle held an infant. A corner of the fabric had slipped away, revealing under the harsh sunlight a tiny face, red and wrinkled, mouth open in silent distress. One small fist protruded from the wrapping, fingers curled tight. Thomas tried to speak, his voice rasping like sand on stone. "Please. They're hunting us." Then his knees buckled. Clara lunged forward, catching him and the child before they hit the wooden planks. Their combined weight nearly pulled her down, but she braced herself, feeling the heat radiating from his sunburned skin. She dragged them inside, kicking the door shut behind her. The shade brought immediate relief, though the house itself held the day's accumulated warmth. She guided Thomas to the bench near the window, laying him down carefully, then taking the infant from his loosening grip. The baby was a girl, perhaps only weeks old, her skin hot to the touch, lips dry and cracked. Clara carried her to the water basin, dampening a clean cloth and pressing it gently to the child's mouth. The baby's tongue moved, seeking moisture, and Clara's chest tightened with both relief and fear. Thomas lay motionless on the bench, his breathing shallow but steady. Clara brought water, lifting his head to help him drink. He swallowed greedily, coughing, then drinking again. When he opened his eyes, they fixed on the baby with an intensity that told Clara everything about why he had come here, and what he feared losing most. Outside, the afternoon sun continued its slow crawl across the sky. But now, faint in the distance, Clara heard the sound she had been dreading, horses, moving slowly, deliberately, as if their riders were searching for something specific. She moved to the window, staying back from the opening, and saw dust rising from the main trail. Several riders, maybe 4 or 5, their silhouettes dark against the bright horizon. Clara pulled the curtain closed, leaving only a narrow gap to watch through. Her hand moved instinctively to the rifle hanging above the door. She had lived alone on this ranch for 3 years, ever since her husband died in a stampede, and she had learned to be ready for trouble. But this felt different. This was not wandering drifters or cattle thieves. This was pursuit. The riders stopped at her gate. One dismounted, a stocky man with a black hat pulled low. He walked to the fence post, looking up at the house, then back at his companions. They spoke briefly, words carried away by the hot wind. Then the man remounted and they rode on, following the trail west. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She turned back to Thomas, who had pushed himself up on one elbow, watching her with those hollow eyes. "Who are they?" Clara asked, her voice steady. Thomas swallowed, wincing. "Men working for Cyrus Brennan. The baby's father." Clara felt the air grow heavier. Everyone in 3 counties knew that name. Cyrus Brennan owned half the territory, ran the biggest ranch, controlled the sheriff, and had a reputation for getting what he wanted by any means necessary. "Why does he want her?" Clara asked, though part of her already knew. Thomas's jaw tightened. Her mother was a woman from the East. She came here thinking she'd marry into wealth, but Brennan only wanted her for show. When she got pregnant and realized what kind of man he was, she tried to leave. He wouldn't let her. When the baby was born, she made me promise to get the child away from him. He paused, his breath catching. She died 2 days after giving birth. Fever took her. I've been running ever since. Clara looked down at the sleeping infant in her arms. The baby's breathing had evened out, her small chest rising and falling peacefully. In the dim light filtering through the curtain, the child looked impossibly fragile. "You're not her father?" Clara asked. "No. I worked on Brennan's ranch. I was just someone who showed her kindness when no one else would. But I gave her my word, and I won't break it." Clara moved to the rocking chair near the hearth, though no fire burned in this heat. She sat down, cradling the baby, and looked at Thomas with clear eyes. "If you stay here, they'll find you eventually. This is the only ranch for 20 miles on this trail." "I know," Thomas said quietly. "I'll rest tonight and move on at dawn. I just needed a safe place for a few hours." Clara rocked slowly, the chair creaking in rhythm with her thoughts. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent, turning the sky from white to gold to orange. The heat would linger long after dark, making sleep difficult, making everything more dangerous. "You won't make it another day in this sun with a baby," Clara said finally. "Not without water, not without supplies, not without someone to help you." Thomas met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something other than exhaustion there. She saw hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. "I'm not asking you to risk yourself for us," he said. Clara looked down at the baby again, at the tiny face that had already known more hardship than any child should. She thought of her own husband, of the child they had hoped to have before he died. She thought of all the empty rooms in this house, all the silence that had filled her days. "You're not asking," Clara said. "I'm choosing." That first night was long and restless. Clara gave Thomas her bed and made a pallet for herself near the baby's basket in the main room. The heat barely lessened after sunset, leaving the air thick and still. Every sound from outside made her tense: the call of a coyote, the rustle of something moving through the brush, the distant thunder of hooves that might have been wild horses or might have been something worse. Thomas slept deeply, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. The baby woke twice, crying with a thin, desperate sound that pierced the darkness. Clara fed her milk from the goat she kept for butter and cheese, warming it carefully, testing it on her wrist before offering the dampened cloth for the baby to suck. It was not ideal, but it was all she had. As dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, Clara stood on the porch with her rifle. The morning air was already warm, promising another brutal day. She scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of riders, any dust trail that might signal danger. But the land was still, empty except for the hawks beginning their morning hunt. Inside, Thomas stirred. Clara heard him moving slowly, painfully, his body protesting every motion after yesterday's ordeal. He appeared in the doorway, squinting against the light. "We should talk about what comes next," Clara said, not turning to look at him. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, keeping to the shade. "I'll leave today. You've done more than enough." "And where will you go? Into the desert with a baby and no supplies? You'll both be dead by noon. Then what do you suggest?" Clara lowered the rifle, finally turning to face him. "You stay here. We tell anyone who asks that you're my cousin from back east, come to help with the ranch. The baby is yours, born to a wife who died in childbirth. It's a common enough story out here. No one will question it if we're convincing." Thomas stared at her. "You'd lie to everyone? Risk Brennan's wrath when he finds out?" "He won't find out unless someone tells him. And right now, the only people who know the truth are you, me, and that baby in there. I plan to keep it that way." "Why?" Thomas asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Clara met his eyes, her own hard as flint. "Because I know what it's like to be alone in this world. And because no child deserves to grow up with a father like Cyrus Brennan." The first test came 3 days later. Clara was in the garden, checking her struggling vegetables in the merciless heat, when she heard horses approaching. 2 riders, moving at a steady pace. She recognized one immediately, Deputy Marshal Hawkins, Brennan's man through and through. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to meet them at the fence, her face showing nothing but mild curiosity. Thomas was inside with the baby, as they had planned. If anyone came asking questions, he would stay hidden until Clara gave the all-clear signal, ringing the dinner bell twice. "Mrs. Clara," Hawkins said, touching the brim of his hat. "Hot day for garden work." "Every day's hot this summer," Clara replied evenly. "What brings you out this way, Marshall?" "Looking for a man. About 6 feet, dark hair, might be traveling with a baby." Hawkins's eyes scanned the property as he spoke. "Stolen property of Mr. Brennan's." "You seen anyone like that?" Clara kept her expression neutral. "Haven't seen anyone in days. Just me and my chickens out here." The second rider, a younger man Clara didn't recognize, spoke up. "Mind if we take a look around, ma'am?" "Actually, I do mind," Clara said, her voice hardening just enough. "This is private property, and unless you have a warrant, you'll stay on that side of the fence." Hawkins's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. "Fair enough. But if you do see anyone matching that description, Mr. Brennan would be grateful for information." "Very grateful. I'll keep that in mind," Clara said, not moving. The two men sat for a moment longer, clearly hoping she would show some sign of nervousness or guilt. But Clara had faced down drought, disease, and death. 2 hired guns on horses didn't rattle her. Finally, Hawkins turned his mount. "You have a good day, Mrs. Clara." "You too, Marshall." She watched them ride away, waiting until they disappeared over the rise before allowing herself to exhale. Then she rang the bell twice, and Thomas emerged from the house, the baby in his arms. "They'll be back," he said. "Probably," Clara agreed. "So we'd better make sure our story is solid." Over the next few weeks, they fell into a routine. Thomas proved useful around the ranch, mending fences, fixing the barn roof, doing all the heavy work Clara had been putting off. He was skilled with his hands and never complained about the labor. The baby, whom they named Sarah after Clara's mother, grew stronger each day, her cries becoming more robust, her eyes following them with increasing alertness. To anyone watching from a distance, they must have looked like exactly what they claimed to be, family making a life together in harsh country. But at night, after the work was done and Sarah was asleep, they would sit on the porch and plan. Plan for what to do if Brennan's men came back with force. Plan for where to hide Sarah if it came to that. Plan for every possibility except the one that seemed most impossible, that they might actually be safe. "Tell me about her mother," Clara said one night, as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Her name was Margaret. She was from Philadelphia, came west because she heard Brennan was looking for a wife. She thought it would be an adventure." He gave a bitter laugh. "She didn't know what he was really like until it was too late." "Were you in love with her?" "No. But I cared about her. She was kind, gentle, everything Brennan wasn't. When she got pregnant, she was terrified. Brennan treated her like livestock, like she was just there to produce an heir for him. When she asked me to help her escape, I couldn't say no." Clara nodded slowly. "And now you're raising her child as your own." "Not as my own. I'm just keeping her safe until she's old enough to make her own choices." That's what Margaret wanted. Freedom for her daughter. The summer dragged on, each day hotter than the last. The grass turned brown, the creek shrank to a trickle, and even the animals moved slowly, conserving energy in the brutal heat. But inside Clara's house, life continued. Sarah laughed for the first time, a sound that made both adults stop what they were doing and smile. Thomas taught Clara how to play cards in the evening, and she taught him how to make bread that didn't turn out like leather. They were careful never to show too much familiarity in public. When they went to town for supplies once a month, they maintained the proper distance of cousins, polite but not intimate. Clara noticed how people watched them, weighing their story, looking for cracks. But they found none. Then came the night everything changed. Clara woke to the sound of breaking glass. She grabbed her rifle and was halfway across the room when she heard Thomas shout from his room. She burst through the door to find him struggling with a man dressed in black, both of them grappling for control of a knife. Clara didn't hesitate. She brought the rifle but down hard on the intruder's head, and he dropped like a stone. Thomas stood gasping, a cut on his arm bleeding freely. There were two, he managed. The other one went for Sarah. Clara's blood turned to ice. She ran to the main room where they kept Sarah's cradle. Another man in black was leaning over it, reaching down. Clara cocked the rifle, the sound loud in the darkness. "Step away from the baby." The man froze, then slowly raised his hands and turned. His face was scarred, his eyes cold. "You don't want to do this, lady. Mr. Brennan just wants what's his. She's not his. She never was. Now get out of my house before I put a hole in you." The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You're signing your death warrant. Then I'll sign it in your blood if you don't move. Now." Something in Clara's voice must have convinced him she meant it, because he backed toward the door, hands still raised. Thomas appeared behind him, now armed with the knife the first intruder had dropped. Together, they forced both men outside, watching as they stumbled into the darkness, making threats that faded as they disappeared. Thomas barred the door, then turned to Clara. In the dim light, she could see he was shaking, whether from fear or adrenaline she couldn't tell. Sarah started crying, frightened by the commotion, and Clara scooped her up, holding her close. "They know we're here," Thomas said quietly. "Brennan knows." "Then we fight," Clara replied, rocking Sarah gently. "This is my land, my home. I won't be driven off it by anyone." The next day, Thomas rode to the neighboring ranches, speaking quietly with the men there. Clara had lived here long enough, been fair enough in her dealings, that people respected her. When Thomas explained that hired guns were threatening a widow and a baby, most agreed to help if it came to violence. Not everyone in the territory was under Brennan's thumb. They fortified the house, boarding up windows, creating firing positions, stockpiling ammunition. Clara sent a letter to the territorial marshal in the capital, explaining the situation and asking for help. She knew it might not arrive in time, but she had to try. While they worked, Clara learned more about Thomas's past. He had grown up in Kansas, the son of a farmer who lost everything to locusts and drought. At 15, he headed west looking for work, taking whatever jobs he could find. He'd worked cattle drives, broken horses, even spent a winter trapping in the mountains before the cold nearly killed him. "I never stayed anywhere long," he told Clara as they hammered boards across the windows. "Never had a reason to put down roots. Just drifted from one job to the next, trying to earn enough to survive." "What made you work for Brennan?" Clara asked, passing him another board. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Money. He paid better than anyone else in the territory. I told myself it didn't matter who I worked for as long as I got paid. But watching what he did to Margaret, how he treated her like property instead of a person, I couldn't stomach it anymore." Clara nodded, understanding. She had made her own compromises over the years, done things she wasn't proud of to keep the ranch running. But there were lines that couldn't be crossed, and Thomas had found his. The work continued through the afternoon. They dug a trench around the house, filling it with anything that would slow an approach: broken glass, sharp rocks, tangled wire. It wouldn't stop determined men, but it might give them warning, might make attackers think twice. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, they stood back to survey their work. The house looked like a fortress now, windows covered, approaches protected, every angle considered. "This might not be enough," Thomas said quietly. "I know," Clara replied. "But it's all we can do." That night, they took turns keeping watch. Clara sat by the window with her rifle, listening to every sound in the darkness. The wind moved through the grass, making it whisper. An owl called from somewhere nearby. In the distance, coyotes sang their evening chorus. All familiar sounds, but tonight they seemed different, charged with possibility. Around midnight, Thomas came to relieve her. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll wake you if anything happens." Clara hesitated, then nodded. She checked on Sarah one more time, watching the baby sleep peacefully, unaware of the danger surrounding them. Then she lay down on her bed, still fully dressed, her boots within easy reach. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by dreams of fire and gunshots. She woke several times, heart pounding, only to hear Thomas moving quietly through the house, making his rounds. Each time, she forced herself to lie back down, to rest while she could. Dawn came with no attack. The morning was clear and hot, promising another brutal day. Thomas made coffee while Clara fed Sarah, both of them moving through the routine with unusual silence. They were waiting, and waiting was sometimes harder than fighting. 3 days later, at high noon when the sun was directly overhead and the heat was at its peak, they came. 8 riders, led by a man on a gray horse that Clara recognized even from a distance. Cyrus Brennan himself. Thomas loaded the rifles while Clara watched from the window. Sarah was in the cellar, safely hidden beneath blankets in case bullets started flying. Clara's hands were steady as she checked her ammunition. She had shot deer, coyotes, and once a rabid dog. If she had to shoot men to protect her family, she would. The riders stopped at the fence. Brennan dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He was a tall man, well-dressed even in the heat, with gray threading through his dark hair. His face was handsome but cruel, the kind of face that smiled while delivering bad news. "Mrs. Clara," he called out. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Clara stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. "I don't have anything of yours, Mr. Brennan. My daughter. A man named Thomas who works for me. Both stolen from my property. Thomas is my cousin. The baby is his daughter, born to his late wife. There's nothing stolen here." Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's an interesting story. Unfortunately, I know it's a lie. The child is mine, born to a woman I was providing for. I want her back." "The child's mother is dead," Thomas called from the doorway. "And with her last breath, she asked that her daughter never be raised by you." "I gave my word." "Your word means nothing," Brennan said coldly. "You're a ranch hand, nobody. That baby is my blood, my heir, and I will have her. One way or another." "Mrs. Clara," he called out. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Clara stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed at the ground. "I don't have anything of yours, Mr. Brennan. My daughter. A man named Thomas who works for me. Both stolen from my property. Thomas is my cousin. The baby is his daughter, born to his late wife. There's nothing stolen here." Brennan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's an interesting story. Unfortunately, I know it's a lie. The child is mine, born to a woman I was providing for. I want her back. The child's mother is dead," Thomas called from the doorway. "And with her last breath, she asked that her daughter never be raised by you." "I gave my word." "Your word means nothing," Brennan said coldly. "You're a ranch hand, nobody. That baby is my blood, my heir, and I will have her. One way or another." Clara raised the rifle, not quite aiming at Brennan but making her intentions clear. "You won't set foot on this property. Turn around and leave, or I'll defend my home." For a long moment, no one moved. The 8 riders tensed, hands moving toward their guns. Thomas appeared beside Clara, his own rifle ready. The hot wind blew dust across the yard, and somewhere a hawk cried out. Then, from behind Brennan's group, more riders appeared. 6 men from neighboring ranches, all armed, all positioning themselves to block any retreat. They said nothing, just sat their horses and waited. Brennan looked around, his jaw tightening as he realized he was outnumbered. He was powerful, but he wasn't stupid. Starting a shooting war here would bring attention from the territorial government, attention he didn't want. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice like gravel. "Yes it is," Clara replied. "That child will never be yours. Leave now, and don't come back." Brennan stared at her for a long moment, then remounted his horse. He wheeled it around and rode off without another word, his men following. The neighbors stayed until the group was completely out of sight, then approached the house. "You all right, Clara?" asked John Weatherby, who owned the ranch to the east. "We're fine, John. Thank you for coming. That man's dangerous. He won't forget this." "I know. But I won't forget who stood with me today, either." The men nodded and rode off, leaving Clara and Thomas alone in the yard. The silence that followed felt different from before. Heavier, but also more certain. Whatever was coming, they had drawn their line. That night, Clara went down to the cellar and brought Sarah back up. The baby had slept through everything, blissfully unaware of the confrontation that had decided her fate. Clara held her on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thomas sat beside her, his arm bandaged from the attack days before. "What do we do now?" "We live," Clara said simply. "We raise this child, we work this land, and we don't let fear run our lives. Brennan won't give up." "Maybe not. But he's not the law, no matter how much he pretends to be. And we're not alone anymore." A week later, a reply came from the territorial marshal. He was sending an investigator to look into Brennan's business practices, including allegations of human trafficking and intimidation. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they were turning. Summer began to break. The first rains came, gentle and welcome, turning the brown grass green again. The creek filled, the garden revived, and the oppressive heat finally lessened. Sarah grew, learning to roll over, to reach for objects, to smile when she saw familiar faces. Thomas proved himself invaluable, not just for the work he did, but for the companionship he provided. Clara realized she had forgotten what it was like to have someone to talk to, someone who understood her choices without judgment. They were not lovers, despite what some townspeople assumed. Their bond was deeper than that, forged in shared danger and shared purpose. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Sarah crawl across the wooden floor, Thomas spoke quietly. "I never thanked you properly. For taking us in. For risking everything." Clara smiled, not looking at him. "You thank me every day by being here, by helping, by being someone Sarah can count on. What happens when she asks about her mother? We tell her the truth. That her mother loved her enough to make sure she'd be free. That's a gift worth remembering." The months passed. Brennan's investigation led to charges, and while he was too connected to face serious jail time, his reputation took a beating. People who had been afraid to speak up found their courage. Stories emerged of other women he had mistreated, of workers he had cheated, of violence covered up by corrupt officials. Deputy Hawkins disappeared one night, reportedly seen heading east on the stage. Without his protection, Brennan's power began to crumble. He withdrew to his ranch and stopped venturing into town, becoming a recluse. Clara filed legal papers to adopt Sarah, with Thomas listed as the child's guardian and her own cousin, making the fiction they had lived official. No one contested it. In the eyes of the law, Sarah was now Clara's daughter. The legal process was longer than expected. The territorial judge, a man named Henderson who had no love for Brennan but still valued procedure, required testimony from neighbors, documentation of Thomas's relationship to Clara, and proof that Sarah was being properly cared for. Clara prepared for each hearing with meticulous care. She gathered letters from the doctor who had examined Sarah and declared her healthy, statements from neighbors attesting to her character, and records showing the ranch was profitable enough to support a child. Thomas testified about his relationship to the baby, sticking carefully to the story they had crafted. The courtroom was sweltering, even with the windows open. Clara sat in her best dress, the one she had worn to her husband's funeral, while the judge reviewed the papers. Sarah sat on her lap, playing quietly with a wooden toy Thomas had carved, oblivious to the proceedings that would determine her future. "Mrs. Clara," Judge Henderson said finally, removing his spectacles to clean them. "You understand that adoption is permanent? That you're taking full legal responsibility for this child?" "I do, Your Honor," Clara replied steadily. "And you, Mr. Thomas, you're willing to serve as guardian should anything happen to Mrs. Clara?" "Yes, sir," Thomas said from his seat beside them. The judge studied them both for a long moment. "I've heard troubling things about how this child came to be in your care. There are those who say she was taken from her rightful father." Clara's heart hammered, but she kept her voice level. "With respect, Your Honor, the child's mother gave her to Thomas with her dying breath. She specifically asked that her daughter not be raised by Mr. Brennan. Whatever his legal rights might be, the mother's wishes were clear." "The mother's wishes," Henderson repeated slowly. "Margaret Brennan, née Whitfield. I've reviewed the marriage certificate. It was legal, which means Cyrus Brennan does have a claim." "He has a claim on paper," Clara said, feeling Thomas tense beside her. "But he has no claim on her heart, her welfare, or her future. That child's mother knew what kind of man he was, and she chose to save her daughter from that fate." Henderson leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Outside, a wagon rattled past, and somewhere a dog barked. The sounds of normal life continuing while Sarah's future hung in balance. "Mr. Brennan has not contested these proceedings," the judge said finally. "In fact, he has not appeared or sent representation, despite being properly notified. That tells me something about his level of interest in this child's welfare." He put his spectacles back on and picked up his pen. "Adoption granted. The child Sarah Thomas is hereby declared the legal daughter of Clara Thompson, with Thomas Thompson as secondary guardian. This court finds that such arrangement is in the child's best interest." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Sarah jump. Clara held her tighter, feeling relief wash through her so powerfully she thought she might cry. Thomas reached over and squeezed her shoulder briefly, his face showing the same emotion. As they left the courthouse, several people stopped to congratulate them. Word had spread about Brennan's abuses, and public opinion had turned against him. Clara noticed that people who had once avoided her eye now nodded respectfully, acknowledging what she had done. On the ride back to the ranch, with Sarah dozing in Clara's arms and the afternoon sun warming their backs, Thomas spoke quietly. "It's really over now. She's legally yours. He can't touch her. Unless he decides law doesn't matter to him," Clara replied. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But for now, we won." Clara looked down at Sarah's sleeping face, at the way her small hand curled around Clara's finger even in sleep. "Yes. We did." On Sarah's first birthday, they held a small celebration. A few neighbors came, bringing modest gifts and good wishes. The house filled with laughter and the smell of Clara's cooking. Thomas carved a small wooden horse for Sarah, and she clutched it with delight, making everyone smile. Clara had spent days preparing for the celebration, wanting it to be perfect. She baked a small cake with precious sugar she had been saving, sweetened with honey from her own hives. The kitchen was decorated with wildflowers Thomas had picked from the meadow, their bright colors bringing life to the simple room. The neighbors arrived in the late afternoon, when the worst heat had passed. John Weatherby and his wife Martha brought a hand-sewn dress for Sarah, tiny and perfect with careful stitching along the hem. The Hendersons from the south brought fresh vegetables from their garden and a jar of preserves. Even old Miguel, who rarely left his cabin, made the journey to bring a silver rattle that had belonged to his own daughter years ago. Sarah, overwhelmed by the attention, clung to Clara at first. But as the afternoon wore on, she warmed to the visitors, especially when Thomas began making funny faces to make her laugh. Her delighted giggles filled the house, and Clara saw several of the women wipe their eyes, touched by the sound. They ate on the porch to catch the breeze, plates balanced on laps, conversation flowing easily. For a few hours, Clara allowed herself to forget about Brennan, about danger, about all the reasons she should be worried. This was what life should be like: friends gathered, a child celebrated, simple joys shared. As the sun began to set, the neighbors prepared to leave. Martha Weatherby pulled Clara aside as they were saying their goodbyes. "You've done something good here," she said quietly. "Taking in that child, giving her a home. The whole territory knows it, no matter what Brennan says." Clara felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Thank you. That means more than you know." When everyone had gone and Sarah was finally asleep, exhausted from excitement, Clara and Thomas cleaned up in companionable silence. They worked together efficiently, having learned each other's rhythms over the months. "That went well," Thomas said, drying the last dish. "It did," Clara agreed. "She'll remember this, I think. Her first real celebration. You made it special for her." Clara smiled, hanging up the dish towel. "We made it special. You carved that horse she loves so much. Did you see how she wouldn't let go of it all day?" Thomas ducked his head, pleased but embarrassed. "It's just a piece of wood. To you, maybe. To her, it's treasure." That night, after the house was quiet and Sarah was sleeping peacefully, Clara and Thomas sat on the porch as they always did. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any artificial light. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked. "Giving up your old life for this?" Thomas thought for a moment. "My old life was working for a man I despised, watching people suffer and pretending not to notice. This life has meaning. I'm keeping a promise to a dying woman, and I'm helping raise a child who deserves better than she would have gotten. No, I don't regret it." "Good. Because you're stuck with us now." He laughed, the sound warm in the darkness. "I can think of worse fates." As another year passed, Sarah began to walk, then to talk. Her first word was not Mama or Papa, but horse, called out excitedly when she saw Thomas riding in from checking the fences. She loved animals, loved the wide open spaces, loved the life they were building together. Clara taught her to gather eggs, to feed the chickens, to recognize the plants in the garden. Thomas taught her about horses, about fixing things, about being gentle with creatures smaller than herself. Together, they gave her a childhood of freedom and safety. The days developed their own rhythm. Sarah would wake at dawn, running to Clara's room to climb into bed for a few minutes of warmth before the day began. Then they would go together to gather eggs, Sarah carrying her small basket with great seriousness. She learned which hens were friendly and which were likely to peck, learned to move slowly so as not to startle them. After breakfast, while Clara worked on household tasks, Sarah would often follow Thomas as he did his morning chores. He was endlessly patient with her questions, explaining everything from how to curry a horse properly to why the barn swallows built their nests in the eaves. Sarah absorbed it all with the intense focus of childhood, asking why until Thomas ran out of answers and started making up increasingly ridiculous explanations that made her giggle. In the afternoons, when the heat was too intense for outdoor work, Clara would teach Sarah her letters using an old primer that had belonged to her husband. Sarah proved to be a quick learner, tracing the shapes with her finger before attempting to write them herself on a small slate. She loved stories, begging Clara to read to her again and again until she had memorized favorite passages. As Sarah grew, her personality emerged clearly. She was bold but thoughtful, adventurous but kind. She collected injured animals, bringing them to Thomas to fix, a bird with a broken wing, a rabbit caught by a dog, even once a snake that had been stepped on by a horse. Thomas built her a small pen where she could keep her patients until they healed enough to release. "You've got yourself a little healer there," John Weatherby commented one day, watching Sarah carefully feed a wounded squirrel with a dropper. "She's got the touch for it." Clara smiled, watching her daughter work with such concentration. "She cares about things. That's a good quality to have." The ranch prospered. With Thomas's help, they expanded the herd, improved the grazing land, and built a new barn. Clara's reputation as a fair dealer spread, and they began to get contracts with the army fort to the north. Money was no longer quite so tight. With the increased income, Clara was able to make improvements to the house. They added a proper bedroom for Sarah, with a real bed frame and a window that looked out over the garden. Clara sewed curtains from fabric she ordered from the general store, cheerful yellow cloth covered in white flowers. Thomas built shelves for Sarah's growing collection of books and treasures. The room became Sarah's sanctuary. She arranged her wooden animals on the shelves with care, lining them up by size. Her favorite, still, was the horse Thomas had carved for her first birthday, now worn smooth from constant handling. She slept with it under her pillow, and Clara often found her talking to it during the day, explaining her thoughts and plans to the silent wooden toy. Life had a fullness it had lacked before. The house, once echoing with loneliness, now rang with Sarah's laughter and questions. Meals were no longer solitary affairs but opportunities for conversation and shared stories. Even the evening chores felt lighter when done with company. One day, when Sarah was 3, a stranger rode up to the house. He was an older man, well-dressed, with kind eyes. He introduced himself as Margaret's father, Sarah's grandfather, and explained that he had been searching for his daughter for years. When he learned of her death and the existence of his granddaughter, he had immediately set out to find her. Clara and Thomas stood on the porch, Sarah between them, as the man explained that he wanted to be part of his granddaughter's life. He bore no love for Brennan, having warned his daughter against him. He only wanted to know the child, to tell her about her mother when she was old enough to understand. The man's name was Edward Whitfield, and he had traveled all the way from Philadelphia. He was a merchant, Clara learned, successful enough to afford the long journey west. His face was weathered with grief, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. "I didn't know Margaret had died until 3 months ago," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "A friend who had moved west sent me a letter. By the time I received it, she had been gone for 2 years. I failed her. I should have come sooner, should have stopped her from marrying that man." Clara saw the pain in his eyes, recognized it as the same she had felt when her husband died. The guilt of survival, the endless what-ifs that haunted the bereaved. "Margaret made her own choices," Clara said gently. "And her last choice was to make sure Sarah would be safe and loved. She succeeded in that." Edward looked at Sarah, who was peeking out from behind Clara's skirt, curious but shy. His eyes filled with tears. "She looks like Margaret did at that age. The same eyes, the same serious expression. Would you like to sit down?" Thomas asked, gesturing to the porch chairs. "We can talk more comfortably." They spent the afternoon talking. Edward told them about Margaret's childhood, how she had been bright and adventurous, always reading stories about the frontier and dreaming of Western adventure. Her mother had died when she was young, and Edward had raised her alone, perhaps indulging her too much, letting her read too many romanticized tales of frontier life. "When she wrote to say she was marrying Cyrus Brennan, I tried to warn her," Edward said. "I had made inquiries about him, heard disturbing things. But she was of age, determined, and I thought perhaps I was being overprotective. I thought perhaps marriage would settle her, make her happy." "You couldn't have known," Clara said. "I should have come myself, should have seen what kind of man he was. Instead, I let her go, and by the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. She stopped writing. Her letters became shorter, sadder. Then they stopped entirely. He pulled out a small packet of letters from his coat pocket, tied with a faded ribbon. These are all I have left of her. I thought Sarah might want them someday, to know what her mother was like before everything went wrong. Clara took the letters carefully, feeling their weight. We'll keep them safe. When Sarah is old enough, she'll read them and know that her mother was loved. Sarah, gradually losing her shyness, came closer to examine the stranger. Edward smiled at her, his expression transforming his grief-worn face. "Hello, Sarah," he said softly. "I'm your grandfather. Your mother's father." Sarah looked at Clara for confirmation, and when Clara nodded, the little girl smiled. "Hello," she said in her small voice. "I brought you something," Edward said, reaching into his other pocket. He pulled out a small music box, intricately carved with roses. "This belonged to your mother when she was your age. I wound it every day after she left, hoping she would come back to hear it again." He opened the box, and a delicate melody filled the air. Sarah's eyes went wide with wonder. She reached out tentatively, and Edward placed the box in her small hands. "For me?" she asked. "For you," Edward confirmed. "So you can remember that you come from people who loved you, even the ones you never met." Clara studied him carefully, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. But all she saw was genuine grief for his lost daughter and genuine love for the granddaughter he'd never met. "You're welcome to visit," Clara said finally. "Sarah should know where she comes from, who her mother was. But this is her home. We won't let anyone take her away." The old man nodded, tears in his eyes. "I understand. And I'm grateful she has people who love her like you do. I don't want to disrupt her life. I just want to be part of it, if you'll allow me." They agreed that Edward would visit twice a year, staying at the boarding house in town and spending time with Sarah during the day. He would write letters in between, send small gifts, and gradually build a relationship with his granddaughter. True to his word, Edward visited regularly over the following years. Each time, he brought stories of Margaret, photographs from her childhood, small treasures he thought Sarah should have. He taught Sarah to read using the same books Margaret had loved. He showed her Philadelphia on maps, described the ocean she had never seen, told her about the wider world beyond the prairie. Sarah adored him. She called him Grandpa and counted the days until his visits with excitement. The connection to her mother's memory enriched her life rather than complicating it, giving her roots that reached beyond the ranch. Meanwhile, Brennan's empire continued to crumble. More legal troubles emerged. His ranch was heavily mortgaged, his workers left for better employers, and his name became synonymous with corruption and cruelty. Some said he went mad, alone in his big house, obsessing over the daughter who got away. The decline was gradual but steady. First, the best hands left his employ, unwilling to work for a man whose reputation had soured. Then the army contracts dried up, officers unwilling to associate with someone under investigation. The bank called in loans, and Brennan was forced to sell off portions of his land to cover debts. Clara heard the news from various sources over the years. The blacksmith mentioned that Brennan's horses were being auctioned. The general store owner said Brennan's credit had been cut off. Travelers passing through told stories of the once grand ranch falling into disrepair, fences broken, buildings unpainted, fields lying fallow. Through it all, Brennan never appeared in person. He became a ghost story, the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about choosing the wrong man. Some claimed to have seen him riding alone at night, a haggard figure on a thin horse. Others said he never left his house at all, that he sat in the dark counting his losses. Clara heard the news but took no satisfaction in it. She had won what mattered, Sarah's safety and freedom. What happened to Brennan was his own doing, the consequences of his own choices. She felt neither pity nor vindication, only relief that he no longer posed a threat. Thomas, however, struggled more with news of Brennan's decline. One evening, after hearing that Brennan had sold the last of his cattle, Thomas sat on the porch looking troubled. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, sitting beside him. "I keep thinking about him," Thomas admitted. "About what he's become. Part of me feels like we destroyed him." "We didn't destroy him," Clara said firmly. "He destroyed himself through his own actions. We just refused to let him hurt anyone else." "I know that. But still, there's something sad about it. He could have been a good man, a good father. Instead, he chose power and control, and now he has nothing." Clara understood. Thomas had a kind heart, even for those who didn't deserve kindness. It was one of the things she respected about him. "You can feel sorry for what he could have been without feeling guilty for what we did," she said. "Sarah is safe, growing up free and loved. That's what matters. His choices brought him to where he is now, not ours." Thomas nodded slowly, accepting her words even if the guilt didn't entirely fade. Some burdens, Clara knew, took time to ease. On a summer evening 5 years after that first desperate knock on her door, Clara stood in her garden watching the sunset. Sarah was playing in the yard, her laughter ringing out as Thomas chased her, pretending to be a fearsome bear. The girl shrieked with delight, running in circles, her dark hair flying behind her. Clara felt a deep sense of peace. Her life had not turned out how she expected. She had thought she would grow old alone, managing her ranch, keeping her grief private. Instead, she had found purpose, family, and joy in the most unexpected places. Thomas caught Sarah and swung her up onto his shoulders. The girl squealed, gripping his hair for balance, still laughing. He walked toward Clara, grinning. "Dinner ready?" he called. "Almost. Wash up, both of you." As they headed toward the house, Sarah called back to her. "Mama, watch me. I'm the tallest person in the world." Clara smiled. "Yes you are, sweetheart. Come on, let's eat." Inside, the table was set, the food was hot, and the house smelled of fresh bread and herbs. They sat together, saying grace, then filling their plates. Sarah chattered about her day, about the calf born that morning, about the butterfly she'd chased. Thomas listened with patience, asking questions, encouraging her observations. Clara watched them and felt grateful. She had saved 2 lives that burning summer day. But in truth, they had saved hers too. They had given her back the family she thought she'd lost forever, the purpose she thought had died with her husband. They had made her house a home again. After dinner, they moved to the porch to catch the evening breeze. Sarah fell asleep in Clara's lap, her small body heavy with exhaustion. Thomas sat nearby, whittling a new toy, the shavings falling into a pile at his feet. "She's getting big," he said softly. "Too fast," Clara agreed. "Sometimes I think about what her life would have been like if we hadn't taken her. If Brennan had raised her." Clara tightened her arms around the sleeping child. "Don't. She's here, she's safe, she's loved. That's all that matters." "You're right. But I'm still grateful every day that you opened that door." "So am I." The stars came out, one by one, filling the dark sky with light. In the distance, coyotes called to each other, and an owl hooted from the barn. The night was peaceful, safe, and Clara knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because some battles are not fought with guns and fists, but with the simple act of opening your door to someone in need. And some victories are not measured in land or money, but in the laughter of a child who knows she is loved. When the sun rose the next morning, painting the prairie in gold and pink, Clara stood on her porch with coffee in hand, watching Thomas teach Sarah how to brush the horses. The girl's serious concentration, the gentle way she handled the brush, the trust the horse showed by standing still, all of it filled Clara with quiet joy. This was not the life she had planned. It was better. And as the years continued to unfold, as Sarah grew from child to girl to young woman, as the ranch prospered and the community they had built around them strengthened, Clara never forgot that it all began with one choice on one burning summer day: to open the door instead of keeping it closed, to help instead of turning away, to choose love over fear. In the end, that choice had saved them all.